Stupendous team. Thank you so much for your time on Cyber Judo tonight. We really appreciate it. Tonight, we're going to be doing a fantastic session. Ryan Johnson is going to be presenting on the history and current state of cyber legislation within the United States of America. One of the things that we were actually previously talking about just a little bit before we started up the recording here was some of the key business drivers and urgencies around an organization and why they may pursue a robust cybersecurity posture, right? And there's a lot of different key drivers, and the one that usually comes to people's minds at the top is, hey, if a malicious actor gains access to the organization's information systems and impacts the operational state of the business, a crypto locker attack or something like that takes down a bunch of the servers, that disrupts the revenue stream, hey, why wouldn't the business leaders want to prevent something like that? At the end of the day, they have to hedge their risks and bets in regards to the amount of resources that they have, how they're going to invest it from a proactive standpoint, how they want to invest perhaps some of those resources from a reactive standpoint. And so a lot of times that is one of the key urgencies and drivers, but another element is also compliance. Compliance in the sense of regulatory requirements, but also compliance in a certain sense of regulatory obligations like PCI DSS, which are not necessarily governmental based, but based on a trade organization. So, for example, PCI DSS is enforced by organizations like MasterCard and Visa, where if for one reason or another you do not protect credit card data, personally PAN numbers, then what will happen is your ability to process credit card and debit card numbers will be revoked from you. And trying to run a business without being able to process credit card and debit card numbers is really, really challenging, really, really difficult. But again, we also have the elements of the just standard government regulatory standpoint. And it's across many different types of domains like, HIPAA for healthcare organizations. I came from a background initially working in healthcare information technology, so that was a big one for me. But there's also so many other industries and spaces. For example, Travis, you worked in the government space for quite some time, which also has a lot of heavy cybersecurity requirements and regulations. So, for example, there might be some organizations that have to comply with things like FISMA and FERPA, right? Travis, was there any other big ones when you were working in the military that from a regulatory standpoint were particularly important for you guys?
I was just before CMMC and I really wasn't in a cyber role, so I couldn't really tell you at that point.
CMMC and NIST 800-171.
That was the only one.
Huge one. Yeah, a huge one if you're a DoD contractor and whatnot. So that all being noted, Ryan, you're going to start us out with the foundations, right, in building why compliance from a cybersecurity standpoint is really important and the history and beginnings of it. So that being said, take it away, good sir.
Thank you. So as Christian said, we'll be talking about the history and current state of cyber legislation within the United States of America. And for the most part, it begins with the legal history of the right to privacy. And something that we value as Americans is the protection and safeguarding of our personal liberties against unjust government encroachment. And it's a balancing act because, as we saw in the events that preceded and followed 9/11, national surveillance is a key priority for the well-being of citizens. So it's a constant balancing act. But proceeding more along the lines of the right to privacy in the United States, it's relatively new legally speaking. The first time that we're actually seeing it written anywhere is in 1890 in the Harvard Law Review in an article titled The Right to Privacy. And the two lawyers there argued that it's more of an extension of a fundamental right to freedom of expression, a freedom to speak just as much as to not have intrusion into your own right to silence. Then also we're seeing it first found in case law in 1928. So that's a large gap, a span of nearly 40 years. The right to privacy was first found in Olmstead versus the United States, and this was during the Prohibition era when the federal agents wiretapped a suspected bootlegger without a warrant. And this is kind of where we're first seeing the intersection of law enforcement activity and government surveillance without warrants. So then that raised the legal question, is there a violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments against illegal search and seizure? And so the judges argued The makers of our Constitution sought to protect Americans and their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations. They conferred, as against the government, the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most valued by civilized men. And so this was talking about the protection from government intrusion, and that should be deemed a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Originally, that ruling wasn't upheld, but later on in the Katz case, it was eventually overturned. Then the next that we see in case law speaking about the rights of privacy, at least a significant case, was in Lawrence versus Texas. And this was talking about government intrusions outside of the dwelling place. In this case, it happened to be homosexual acts in public, but the state argued that freedom extends beyond spatial bounds, so not necessarily within the home is an individual privy to their own right to privacy, and that there is a liberty and an autonomy that the state should potentially stay out of. So respect for their private lives, and that's an interesting wording that we'll see developed later on, because it's relating to the due process clause without government intervention. Now looking at it from the government standpoint, what are the legal foundations of government surveillance? And the first that we're seeing is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. That's in 1978. We're seeing the establishment of procedures for the requesting and obtaining of intelligence information that protects the privacy of individuals. And we hear a lot of times, and something that Edward Snowden alluded to was these foreign intelligence surveillance courts. What are they actually doing? There's no checks and balances, or not necessarily appointed. And it's not well known to anyone outside of Congress and those directly involved in that work. But they're responsible for reviewing and approving requests, and that actually stemmed back from what was established in this act in 1978. The next significant act that we're seeing is the USA Patriot Act, and that was enacted in response to 9/11. And this expanded the government's surveillance powers, basically for the right to national security issues. The USA Patriot Act allowed investigations without a warrant. So this was a step backward, contrary to what a lot of the earlier precedents set in the courts were. But as we'll see later on, in 2015, the Patriot Act was amended, and this was directly in response to the Snowden exposure. The government has to have a limitation on their ability to collect and retain certain types of information, keyword certain types. So where is this check and balance actually headed? The Freedom Act required greater transparency and accountability in government surveillance programs, specifically the publication of all the reports of the numbers of targeted individuals for surveillance and the impact on privacy and civil liberties. So we're beginning to see things like limitations on the NSA with phone record collection and things of that nature. Now there's court orders required to access phone records, and we're not seeing telecommunication companies outright breached. So there's more of a holdback now on companies and service providers. The act also created a panel of experts to provide input on privacy and civil liberties, and this was exactly the check and balance that was needed to see how that's directly tied into the government surveillance. This panel, known as the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, was given the authority to review government surveillance programs and make recommendations for improvements. And as I said earlier, the Freedom Act that amended the Patriot Act was directly in response to Edward Snowden's disclosures regarding the NSA surveillance programs. Any questions so far? Anything in the chat?
No, we're looking good so far. Thank you.
Good deal. All right, and so now this is where we're starting to get into the actual cyber-focused legislation. The first that we'll see is in 1986, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA of 1986. And this is interesting because there's both civil and criminal penalties for violations. And you'll see down this list an entire enumeration of facets that weren't explicitly described, such as now we're seeing more checks and balances on things like online harassment and stalking, hacking tools, even the conspiracy to commit cybercrime, and then also increased penalties for cybercrime, and to clarify a definition of exceeding authorized access. So this is particularly important for those interested in offensive security. Then FISMA, we're seeing the Federal Information Security Management Act. This was established in 2002, and it's a framework for protecting government information, operations, and assets against natural and man-made threats. FISMA's real requirements are to develop and implement risk-based information security programs, and this is all for the protection of data. And so FISMA also required the federal agencies to conduct assessments, and that was also an important key feature. And now those results were reported to the Office of Management and Budget. And here we're actually seeing NIST providing guidelines and standards for how FISMA requirements were to be implemented, because a key feature of Congress is not necessarily just to provide the legislation, but they're also responsible for the implementation and oversight. And it was interesting to see the way that they leveraged NIST to provide those guidelines. Then we're looking specifically now at the protection of critical infrastructure. This is something near and dear to my heart as a CISA employee. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 created the Department of Homeland Security, and this was responsible for protection against domestic and foreign threats. And this is where we're actually beginning to see a government focus on mitigating cyber threats to critical infrastructure. And here we're actually seeing collaboration between federal agencies, state and local governments, and tribal organizations, along with private sector partners. So there's greater teamwork here established as a result of this act. Then the Homeland Security Act also established the NCCIC, which is now known as CISA, and they are responsible for coordinating the federal government's response to major cyber incidents affecting critical infrastructure. Now, in 2014, we see the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2014, and this is a focus on cybersecurity research and development, workforce training, and public awareness and education. So this is more moving away from corporate responsibility, not ignoring it, but passing it and saying now this is something to be instilled in the public consciousness, that cybersecurity is everyone's concern. And now the act established a National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence within NIST, and their best practices and standards were developed for cybersecurity purposes. We see things like scholarship programs to encourage students to pursue degrees in cybersecurity related fields, to include computer science and data science. We're also seeing once again, another focus on risk assessments and reporting. And reporting is a consistent theme that we're going to see leading to the most current cyber legislation of major impact. The act also required the government now to have a cyber workforce strategy, because when you have such a massive attack surface like the government has, you have to have the necessary personnel to address the cybersecurity threats, and that's something that's still unfolding. How are we doing so far?
Doing good. No major questions.
Okay. And the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 was meant to encourage the voluntary sharing of cyber threat information between private entities and the federal government. And actually, this is where one of the major contentions begin, primarily because the private sector has a wide variety of sources for reporting and data that the government isn't necessarily privy to, couldn't necessarily mandate private industry to hand over, but nonetheless would be helpful for understanding the cybersecurity landscape as a whole, especially from a vulnerability management perspective. And we're seeing challenges, especially in government cooperation with the banking and other large financial industries and their partners currently. And CISA is providing liability protection here for private entities to say, hey, one of the major concerns in our earlier conversations were we weren't comfortable sharing data with the government, because if we did and we had some boo-boos there, we don't have liability protection. And so both the private industry and legislators got together to provide that liability protection, which was really helpful to actually encourage that sharing of information, specifically in information related to major breaches, such as ransomware attacks and reporting. We're also seeing the CISA require the federal government to develop procedures to protect privacy and civil liberties. Once again, another foundational principle here we're seeing repeated. And the critics here unfortunately said that this is going to only lead to increased government surveillance and do nothing to protect individual privacy and civil liberties. So now moving to more modern legislation, in March of 2021, we're seeing the State and Local Government Cybersecurity Act of 2021. This is a challenge because never before in the legislation had there been demands put on states and actual tribal organizations. The federal government wasn't allocating resources, but due to the ever-growing attack surface, we realized that state and local governments needed to become a more involved stakeholder in securing their own attack surface. We'll also see the Federal Rotational Cyber Workforce Program Act introduced to have the necessary trained personnel to address these threats. The purpose of the act was to establish a program to develop and train federal employees in cybersecurity. And this was a hope essentially to increase retention and development within organizations and other components within DHS and beyond. And so there they have a steering committee to oversee the program and to develop the guidelines for the selection and training of participants. And more information will hopefully be released on that in the coming years. And then one of the major other sources of legislation that's still ongoing and being defined is actually CIRCIA. It's the critical incident reporting legislation that was passed in 2021, which basically says by 2025, CISA and their partners are charged with monthly and quarterly reports to Congress on the vulnerabilities, and hopefully this is to inform Congress on how they can best allocate resources to mitigate threats. So as a key focus throughout, what really is leading to effective cyber legislation? Well, first, it has to be timely because right now where we are in the AI world, we don't have a great enough understanding of the use cases and where it can really unfold. So unfortunately, some legislation is necessarily reactive. There's clearly also the balance of the need for security and surveillance/intelligence with that individual privacy and civil liberties piece. The next part, and this is the most difficult, the clear and informed guidelines for individuals and organizations to follow. We see the use of NIST consistently, yet compliance can actually result in cybersecurity theater rather than meaningful change for organizations. And that's something that we'll continue to battle because at the end of the day, the people working in the working committees to address and inform their other counterparts within Congress are relying on the information fed to them from private industry and specifically from organizations like CISA and other federal agencies. And the other side of it is, how do you establish consequences for non-compliance? Because as we saw earlier, there needed to be that liability protection for private industry to want to be forthright with their data in order to address breaches and beyond. But if there's no consequences and blatant errors can continue to be made, then companies don't necessarily have the reason to increase or maintain a reasonable cybersecurity budget. And as Will said last week, the worst thing in cybersecurity is apathy. And that's something that incentivizing or enforcing consequences will lead to compliance. But the question is that compliance enough? Then the next is that appropriate funding, because the government can make all the demands that they want, but is it a reasonable ask? And is there the room for implementation and enforcement within companies? Because as we saw with the state, local, and tribal entities, there is a huge reliance on government grants and also too that workforce recruitment strategy, which is so essential to adequately staffing these initiatives. And so all of this leads, hopefully, in the legislation to collaboration between government and private sector entities. And this addresses both proactive and reactive measures. And hopefully, at the end of the day, transparency and accountability in government surveillance programs.
Cool. Well, thank you for all that insight. I had a couple of questions that came to my mind as you were kind of going through things. Would it be all right if I throw a couple out there?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, a lot of this conversation has again been centric to the legislation that's been very pertinent to CISA. And one of the things that I find myself when I interface with a lot of different organizations is they don't realize the type of free content out there that's already readily available that they could be leveraging and utilizing. And a lot of times, a lot of organizations will have the impression that they have to invest in costly, expensive commercial tooling to start getting, starting to build a robust cybersecurity program. So, when it comes to your perspective, what are the top, let's say, 3 or 5 resources that CISA provides that organizations could best leverage to start to build their cybersecurity programs and improve their security posture?
Right. Just as a disclaimer before this, all of the content here is expressed merely as a student interested in law and more or less not necessarily representing the government in any form. But that being said, with that disclaimer in mind, there's outward-facing vulnerability scans, which are free that CISA offers. One of the other things too that's meant to encourage reporting is that there's actually a central intake desk where you're able to report any cyber incidences and have boots on the ground more or less to assist you. And then also we're usually well represented at various booths and conferences and beyond. And more or less, if you reach out to the central intake with any questions, we're more than happy to provide information free of charge and consults to our stakeholders.
Okay, cool. I appreciate that context. One of the reasons why I asked is because, obviously, when we talk a bit about CISA, they've created a lot of really cool tools and resources that I've pointed to people towards in the past, like CSAT, which is basically a cybersecurity evaluation tool that essentially anyone can download and deploy to their own environment, which is a series of questionnaires to start to threat model the organization's security posture, right, and understand what are the top risks that might be presented to the organization's administrative, technical, and physical safeguards and information systems. Is there any other maybe specific resources that might come to your mind, like a specific tool that you've come across as of late or anything like that, or documentation set or anything?
There's a wealth of publications in almost every area you can imagine within cybersecurity that can be found on our webpage. Another cool set of resources, as you mentioned, and I haven't had the chance to play with all of them being so new myself, is CISA has their own GitHub. And so that's something to definitely look into. They're constantly adding it. We've got a wonderful DevSecOps and threat hunt team constantly adding content there.
Yeah, I know one of the more recent tools that CISA released was the Red Eye tool used for red and blue teams to interface with one another and diagramming those data sets. There was a pretty cool one that I used to refer people to. I haven't leveraged it as of late, called Crossfeed. And so, for anyone out there who's just looking to get an initial fingers on the pulse of your attack surface for your organization, Crossfeed is essentially a solution that connects into a lot of the common open source intelligence and reconnaissance tools that we leverage in standard pen testing processes. So Crossfeed will talk to Census and Shodan and Find Domain and Wapalizer and AMAS it'll actually even talk to DNS Twist, which is one of our favorites that we leverage in-house to look for things like typo squatted domains that malicious actors might have acquired as they're trying to stage and set up like a social engineering campaign against a particular organization. So, certainly that's one of the things that, I would highly recommend if, somebody is looking to have a inexpensive way to just start to gain an understanding of their attack surface. Take a look at Crossfeed. It's pretty good a while back when I was playing with it. That being said, Mike, Travis, Dennis, was there any good CISA content materials tools that you guys have had the opportunity of playing with that are kind of like good tips and tricks for organizations to leverage?
Well, the one I used on a daily basis is certainly their known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, where they can really help you filter down what's a theoretical vulnerability and what have malicious actors actually used. So that's a really awesome free resource where you can search by the CVE and you can find out, how big of a deal is it really, right? Is this a theoretical CVE someone found doing some research, or is it something that known APTs or known threat actors have been regularly using, and it has that evidence, it has that data? So that really helps me prioritize any recommendations I give, because if there's something that is readily exploitable with known exploits out there, that's an inherently more significant thing to address than something that might have a higher CVSS score, but it hasn't ever actually been demonstrated in the wild. So I mean, that's my favorite CISA feature for sure.
Cool, that's good to know. Anything that comes to your mind, Mike, Dennis?
For me, I haven't messed around enough with any CISA content to actually put that out, to be entirely honest. So I'll have to defer to Michael on this one.
Yeah, I'm the same way with Travis. Definitely the CV score one is popular, just so you can map it easier. But what my initial question, I think, Ryan, was when you were talking about providing clear, informed guidelines for individuals and organizations to follow, right, for effective cyber legislation. Has CISA, I know, and this is probably a hot topic from back in 2015, 2016-ish, but I know there was a case where the FBI was trying to get Apple to disclose a way to get through their software to unlock the iPhones of the San Bernardino shootings, right, in California. So I'm wondering if CISA had any plans in the future, because I know Apple has consistently fought this over and over, even in 2018, 2019, 20, and on. And I'm wondering if you, coming from CISA, working from CISA, if you guys can foresee being able to breach that, privacy versus, we needing to know shit now, so that's always on my mind on that with the FBI versus Apple. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear it.
This is definitely coming more from a personal viewpoint, and certainly doesn't necessarily represent the views of CISA. But that being said, pretty much Congress is driving the vehicle once it comes to defining those authorities. As you mentioned, something like the FBI actually has law enforcement authorities, whereas CISA doesn't necessarily have those. They're not enumerated to CISA. So that actually comes from efforts like we're seeing in the JCDC, where there's actual joint partnerships between CISA, NSA, FBI, and beyond. And a lot of the recommendations made to Congress will actually arise from these working groups. And so at this point, the best that I can say is something to stay tuned for.
Okay. Mike, that actually brings to my mind in regards to international collaboration, right, amongst cybersecurity agencies trying to protect not just organizations but individuals from malicious actors and state actors. And always, all the time when I'm conducting research into a particular new topic or domain, or I'm always looking for new guides and standards, obviously I see a lot of US centric stuff, but I always get a lot of really great, and Travis, you probably see this all too, Australian Cybersecurity Center. Do they not have some fantastic material and content? So one of the things I wanted to perhaps get a little bit of insight into is, Ryan, do you happen to know the level of collaboration that might occur between, let's say, United Kingdom's NS or NCSC or the Australian ACSC with CISA?
The answer to that question is the collaboration is constant. In certain ways, we actually rely on a lot of the same feeds for information, and so at that point, we're constantly updating the Kev catalogs and things of that nature, joint press releases, and so kind of what you see out in public is what we know at this present time.
By the way, I was also waiting for somebody to say one of the most awesome things that CISA has created that organizations should be leveraging more and more of is NIST CSF. The NIST cybersecurity framework was created in joint between NIST, right, in CISA, and it being very lean and mean and easy to follow and being very practical to the life cycle of a malicious actor trying to gain access to an organization, trying to then perform some level of lateral movement and privilege escalation and persistence. So certainly when it comes to an organization who might just be a bit on the smaller side, who is looking to find a way to build a fairly robust written information security program and set of policies, probably aligning to the NIST CSF framework first would be a good, easy, approach. Either that, or I would usually say maybe CIS V8 and then focusing on implementation group 1 controls. But NIST CSF is certainly one of the most, I would say a crown jewel type of resources that CISA has created.
Absolutely. And like you're touching on, luckily there's a catalog of full lifecycle vulnerability management best practices and tool sets out there for free. And I think it's just going to take a much broader effort, both from the federal agencies and from private industry collaboration to bring about and foster this awareness.
Cool. Do we let's see here. Do we got any other big questions in the chat here? Oh, Adam, thank you for calling us out. Not a problem at all. We always really appreciate interfacing with the rest of the community. And then, Steve, CISA tabletop exercise package documentation is something he's looking at doing for his tabletops. That's a great call out. I've never actually used their tabletop documentation here. So that's CTAP here. Wow. Well, thank you for that insight, Steve. Really appreciate you spreading that for everybody.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, Ryan, actually. I don't remember if it was CISA or not. Does CISA put out documentation and guidelines for best practices for configuration of systems?
They do.
They do? Okay. I think actually then, to Christian's point, I think I've actually utilized some of the Linux resources in that regard. So I redact my last comment. I have followed some of the best practices guides for the Linux setups in that case.
That's awesome. And so what has been your experience with it?
I know that there is, so I believe they're put out in 2 forms. I want to say they have general guidelines and then they have like a tool specific guideline where it actually checks it. I forget what it is. I forget what the actual format is. I found the format, unfortunately, given the systems that I've deployed on, I don't think it's a CISA issue. I just think the format's a little janky for evaluation, just because Linux systems vary based on distribution, so it's hard to get that accurate. But as far as the actual recommendations go, yeah, I think they're great recommendations. I try to stick with them. I think I was experimenting with Red Hat when I first found them, and that was what led into that, because they have the whole. I think Red Hat has you do the manual partitioning. And I remember going through some guidelines for that for best practices, but I found they work pretty well. I think they're good advice. It's just a matter of the evaluation tools aren't there yet. But that's not the fault of CISA. That's like just the method that they have of evaluating it is not. It's not general enough, and there's so many minute differences between systems. It's hard to catch all. But yeah, good overall. If you follow the advice, I recommend it.
That's great. And so, Christian, actually, I have a question for you. When you're looking from your perspective as a business owner, how do you approach current cyber legislation and policy frameworks when you hear about new proposals? And what are your immediate thoughts in the aftershock of policy implementation?
Well, when you talk about cyber legislation, the thing that drives at least, my firm the most are the types of organizations that we usually work in or work with and their particular market segments. We work with a lot of organizations that are not necessarily adjacent to the government or DoD. So I have the tendency of kind of staying away from that type of legislation material and content. The reason being is that that market segment's not just a particular fit for me as a business owner, but we work with a lot of folks, mostly in healthcare, fintech, banking, also in registered investments. And so the regulations that we tend to be most privy to and follow up to are going to be things like HIPAA, anything that has to do also with CMS, which is, relates back to Medicaid and Medicare and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to fintech, a lot of times it's going to be adjacent and related to things like NYDFS 500, cybersecurity requirements. There's going to be a lot of things when it comes to sometimes like GLBA, sometimes SOX will be particularly important if it's a public organization. As for investment firms, which is one of the biggest verticals that we've been focusing on as an organization on late and providing cybersecurity services to that particular vertical, it's the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, because they have cybersecurity readiness requirements and initiatives. And actually, I recently did a webinar, not last week, but the week before, all on that, because they're codifying more of that. And right now they have some new proposed legislation that's open for comment. But we also have to kind of stay abreast to cybersecurity requirements that are outside of the United States. So, for example, FCA is very big for registered investment firms that are in the United Kingdom. And also we work with a lot of organizations that may have to comply with data privacy laws that are outside of the United States. So while we're very familiar with data privacy laws that are like, for example, CCPA in California, you have general cybersecurity legislation and guidance with the New York Shield Act. We also have to think about things like Canada, right? And PIPEDIA, where that's more centric to protecting the privacy of Canadian citizens. We do also have to stay up to date and abreast to the latest breach notification laws across the United States, and every single state has its own different flavor of breach notification laws. So it's one of the things that we try to, on a semi-annual basis, go through and run a set of scripts and pull it from the internet, and then try to digest it and break it down of like, hey, what's the reporting period necessary if there is a breach that particularly occurs, and what's the requirement for providing data privacy protection and credit monitoring services for those who are affected, all that kind of stuff. That kind of differ state by state that we have to monitor for, and then we publish to GitHub. We open source that content for folks. This way it's easy for organizations to kind of have a quick hit list from a regulatory standpoint, what things apply to them or what doesn't. But in particular, like legislation that may be very like what we're talking about here, the Federal Rotational Cyber Workforce Program Act, those are things that we're not usually particularly privy to step by step across the way. And the reason being, while they're fantastic initiatives for the United States government to help institute better security readiness for the organizations and for folks across the United States, but particularly for the government and municipal bodies and states and all that, we're just a little bit less privy to that because we're just not a very government heavy shop here, to be perfectly transparent. Does that help answer your question?
It does. And I think that kind of leads more into my second question then is, how do you approach the GRC piece of the conversation after your assessments with your customers? What are their common questions regarding the legislative frameworks, or maybe even more on the policy and compliance end of the deal.
Well, I'll be transparent with you in that. At the end of the day, business decision makers have to take incredibly complex data sets across their organizations of managing tens, hundreds, thousands of staff members, across hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of assets and systems, hundreds of laws that they have that apply to the organization, not just cybersecurity specific, right? So usually the top executive management at organizations is not going to be particularly interested in specific nuances of legislation. They're driven by what is going to impact the organization top line and bottom line, and what are those items that are adjacent to that, like reputational harm that could occur to the business, or a disruption to business operations that could then affect the revenue stream. So while they do care about legislation, they really care about legislation in regards to what's the slap on the wrist, what are the fines, what is the impact to their organization if they do not comply with various types of legislation. And so a lot of times what firms are going to be trying to follow to is what are the specific cybersecurity requirements or information security requirements that are going to apply to their firm. I would say about 30 to 40% of them are proactive in adopting those requirements in advance. Probably a good 50% after that are a little bit reactive and trying to stay abreast in some general alignment to that. And then 10% of organizations just don't care or are completely naive, and they're actually been in the red and they have some type of breach, or they don't have a breach and they're just coasting, and they're just coasting out there. Even though the law applies, at the end of the day, the law is only as good as if someone gets caught and it gets enforced against them. And so one of the big elements for organizations in the past is that there really hasn't been a lot of slaps on the wrist that have had a significant impact to them. I want to say though, while we have this now greater, significance of ransomware attacks impacting organizations and all that kind of stuff, and so certainly cybersecurity is now more at the forefront of business leaders' minds, and now they measure, I think, cybersecurity risk closer to just regular organizational operational risk. The fact is that at the end of the day, they're going to just try to comply with the minimum requirements that is stated for them and to scoot on by with that. And that's the particular case. They don't like the legislative tidbits or diving into the details, unfortunately, which in my opinion sometimes is underappreciative, but also totally understandable in, these professionals, what they do and all the data that they already have to process. A lot of that they try to delegate down, obviously, to chief compliance officers and chief information security officers, who in their own right, when they try to interpret the legislation, it's still very, and this is where I have a particular challenge, and I kind of am a bit annoyed with legislators, is that it's still too legalese. That taking it and breaking it down where it's digestible and understandable to people is sometimes a bit difficult. One of the things I love about, for example, CISA with the cybersecurity framework, right, is it's very it's very easy to wrap your head around it, objectively what you need to do and how it can impact the organization and make things a bit better and whatnot. But a lot of times, governmental bodies will purposely create laws that are generally ambiguous and difficult to enforce correctly. I think GDPR is probably one of the best examples where there's a law out there that has so many elements of ambiguity, and that means that the enforcement of it can be essentially up to the regulatory body of how they feel at any particular day or whatever their bias or interest is. So I think that's what's kind of made people a bit jaded about actually trying to dive in sometimes to the letter of the law text, because they just want to know what the checklist is, fit to the check boxes. And so hopefully somebody doesn't come along, right, and, rattle their cage and give them a difficult time. You know what I mean? No,
thank you very much for that insightful response.
Yeah, not a problem.
I would say two things. I would say to one of your points, Christian, some organizations, they like to take the approach of Schrodinger's breach. There can't be a breach if we never observe the breach. And to a second to a second point, that I think that in some situations it's unfortunate, but as you know, there have been organizations that I've seen in the past that have actually gone through and preferred cyber insurance, like breach insurance, right? Rather than actually securing the architecture and the system, just because financially it is, I guess, makes more sense, even though, the actual information would be lost, it would be breached and all of that. I guess they decide that that is the more viable option. And it's unfortunate. It's very sad to see, but it does happen. So
the advent and the spread of cybersecurity insurance in the 2010s and onwards is one of those things where it's like it's bittersweet, in the sense of it's really, really great that we have, cybersecurity insurance that can help provide some level of buffer to organizations, particularly small businesses and whatnot, in case something happens, because it could be sometimes initially difficult to invest in the cybersecurity, which at least that used to be the case back in the day. But now I would even say the smallest of organizations can invest in having a pretty good cybersecurity posture at minimal cost, right? But the flip side to that, the negative side to that, is what you just noted there, which is organizations at the end of the day, that they're running a business, right? There has to be some level of profitability there, and they have to measure everything into some level of what is the worst case scenario risk and hedging their bets. And a lot of organizations in the past hedged their bets on the fact that investing in the cyber insurance was a better approach. And now what that has led to, right, is the promulgation of essentially cybersecurity insurance becoming more difficult to obtain, and cybersecurity insurance policies not being nearly as inclusive, right? And on top of that, now we're getting to the point where there are a lot of different governmental bodies, and there was some hearsay and talk, and I haven't been following to it as much, but for example, in the UK, about making things like ransomware payments to malicious actors and illicit activity, which in my mind, it's a kind of something that I kind of concur with. And I know it's a controversial topic, but, at the end of the day, when you pay, a malicious actor, you pay them the ransom, right? What you're essentially doing is you're incentivizing that business, right? At the end of the day, these are black market businesses, right? They have to have some type of, profit incentive, right? And if there are people who are going to pay for that thing, there is going to be a demand for that thing, right? And malicious actors can build and generate that demand as they see fit. And it's getting scarier and scarier, because the barrier to entry for malicious actors to break into organizations is getting lowered every single day, more and more and more, with easy to use tools. Script kiddie tools used to be a big thing, and even, by the way, I still consider myself in many, many ways a script kiddie, right? The thing is now is with large language models like ChatGPT, now it's even easier to build like exploits and reverse shells, right? And to analyze a piece of code for vulnerabilities and say, can you describe to me from a SaaS standpoint what vulnerabilities might exist in this code? And it'll describe it to you, right? Those are the types of things where somebody who had previously almost no real cybersecurity experience or knowledge, but was just only bit dangerous enough to dip their toes into the jargon, right, in the lexicon, now they're more empowered than ever to go leverage those tools to go attack small businesses, right? And unfortunately, small businesses in certain market verticals are slow to adapting towards sophisticated malicious actors. I previously worked in the healthcare space. Man, healthcare space, and this is nothing to say bad about healthcare institutions, it's an incredibly tough industry. And there's a lot of stress in it, because you don't just, by the way, have an outage and it's like, oh yeah, it impacts the business's profitability. It's like, no, that could be a patient care issue, right? There could be people's lives that get lost over it. You feel absolutely guilty about it. So there's almost a moral imperative to make sure when you're on the blue team working in healthcare information technology, you do your best. So that's filled with some of the hardest working, people I've ever met and most intelligent people I've ever met. But I will tell you what, when it comes to a development standpoint for electronic medical record systems and PACS systems and practice management systems, they use some really antiquated code and technologies and whatnot. And it's like sometimes being forced at gunpoint, right? Of having to use old things like Windows Server 2008 R2 and 2012. And what is wrong? What is going on here? And how do you, even though as a cybersecurity professional, that you need to adapt, right? But you're stuck to those old elements of technical debt. So just to that initial, again, point that even when you get cybersecurity insurance and all that kind of stuff, it can be very, very difficult to kind of get out of that cycle there when you have aggressive technical debt like that too,
No, I think the companies are probably going to have to move more towards how actual insurance is done in that regard. I'm sure they are. I'm not aware of the current state of it, to be honest. I haven't messed around with cyber insurance for probably ever, but
I get it all.
Never too much in depth.
I get it all the time working with not just small businesses, but honestly, working with a lot of multi-billion-dollar organizations. Many of our clientele come to me and talk to me all the time about like, hey, it's getting really, really difficult to get cybersecurity insurance. And our premiums are sky high now. It's like 3 times, 5 times the amount than before,
See, the thing about it is I don't necessarily disagree with that entirely, because the problem was originally, right, is that I think the bar was set too low. It was just like, oh, you want insurance? Yeah, you can buy. But then I think what happened is they realized, oh, we actually have to pay this if something happens. I think it makes sense if it's more like modern insurance for healthcare, right? If you're going to get insurance for healthcare, right, they check for your pre-existing conditions, right? They evaluate you, they say, oh, like especially life insurance, right? If you're going to die, are you close to death? Do you have some sort of terminal condition? You have to pre-qualify for a certain amount. I think it makes similar sense to do the same thing with cybersecurity, where they say, hey, we evaluate your architecture. It looks like you're terribly insecure, so we're only going to offer you this much, and unless you can improve it, we're not going to offer you more. I think that makes perfect sense.
So that's what they've been doing now. The majority of cyber insurance companies now do that, where it's essentially a set of questionnaires. Sometimes they'll do a level of attack surface analysis, which is goofy because sometimes they'll be like, oh, we happen to find out that your DMARC record, right, is set with a tilde, right, rather than a dash. Okay. And that's a problem, right? Like goofy things like that. It's like, you can't have a soft fail. That needs to be a hard fail on your DMARC.
Do you know port 80 is open, even though port 80 is specifically used to redirect to 443?
Exactly. Did you know that it accepts, plain text stuff on port 80? No, it's a redirector, man. It's a redirector. So there is a lot of, unfortunately, really terrible attack surface passive analysis tools that sometimes cyber insurance companies run, and you got to explain it to them, and you kind of roll your eyes throughout the process. Yeah, the deductibles are higher too. Yeah, Steve makes a great point there. Yeah, it's and so the questionnaires are getting more specific, and now they're starting to ask for more evidence and that kind of stuff, which is a great thing to see. There is unfortunately still for a lot of organizations and firms not the imperative to get cybersecurity insurance in the first place. So, there's a lot of times where somebody's just like, well, why would I get cybersecurity insurance? Trying to explain that to somebody where, we're all cyber folks here. So it's like, it makes sense to us. It's like a fundamental thing of like, why not? But having to actually break that down into layman's terms and also to a business leader's terms of, well, the practical investment in that and why to actually do that can sometimes be a bit of a tough challenge, depending on what vertical they're in, the size of the organization, the complexity of their tech stack, all that kind of stuff. But that being noted, Mike, really good note there, by the way, about, I've always said Revil. Is it Revil or Re-Evil?
I think it's just Revel, but like they always capitalize the R and E, so it was always like a name play on reverse engineering. But I think their whole thing was ransom, like evil ransomware, right?
Yeah.
So for me, even when cybersecurity was a cybersecurity insurance was a bigger thing. I think a lot of companies, they would call in, they would report these issues right to the FBI, whoever else, and these guys would come in, they would seize their servers, for like 2 or 3 days at a time, 2 weeks. And some mom and pop companies just simply couldn't afford to be down that long. So then, of course, the cyber insurance companies came in, they're like, hey, do this, we'll do that. And then all of a sudden you have groups like this pop up that starts targeting these mom and pop places, knowing that they're going to get a payday out of it because they can't afford to be down this long, right? From reporting investigations with government, with FBI, with whoever else comes in, because those are all search and seize at that point. Operations is down until they get all those things situated. So a lot of times back in the like the early 2010s, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you had issues where security was just where security insurance was used almost as a crutch by these attacker groups that would target these guys on purpose, saying, hey, we're gonna get an easy payday out of this because they can't afford to be down. They're gonna pay us, and their insurance company is gonna do it for them. So it was I hope it's come a long way. I'm like with Dennis right now, where I haven't investigated it since like 2017ish. Did a couple papers back in in college, things like that. But I mean, it was just an easy payday just because they knew that they would go straight to the insurance because these companies could not afford to have this downtime like that.
Yeah. I did a webinar on cyber insurance last year, so I'd like to kind of like refresh my knowledge on it and whatnot. Again, it's adapted a little bit, but now it's to a point where, again, deductibles are higher, premiums are higher. It's a bit more challenging to get it, and they're getting better with the questionnaires. I don't think the bullshit checking there is quite on par yet. It's like the majority of them that I see are usually 30 questions long, and they don't require you to produce much for evidence. That being said, again, I hope that it kind of builds to a better place. And I hope there's a lot more regulation that does form actually around the fact of paying malicious actors a ransom, having some level of decentivizing that. It's so easy for folks to give in and do that. And again, then that keeps it to be a profitable business, for malicious actors. And it's now to the point where ransomware is now, gotten to the same level of sophistication as technology service providers, where there's now ransomware as a service. And by the way, for anyone who's interested, I want to say about 2 months ago, I did a whole cyber judo session on ransomware as a service, and ransomware prevention tips and tricks and all that kind of stuff. So certainly if anyone is interested, feel free to take a look at our YouTube for that. We got a lot of good content on ransomware and deep diving on that. So that being said, looks like we're about a little past 10 here. Ryan, thank you for all this insight on cybersecurity legislation throughout the United States, both historically over time and in the current state of it, and how it applies to businesses. Is there any last points or words that you wanted to hit on?
I went ahead and linked your ransomware training in the chat for people.
Awesome, man.
You touched on all the major points, realizing that compliance, whether we like it or not, is the driver, but it's only to the level that companies are incentivized or disenfranchised from falling away from those regulatory requirements. And that question of cyber insurance comes into the picture. And now with the increase of technologies such as those large language models like ChatGPT, the threats and the attack surface are ever increasing. And that's something that has to be accounted for in this legislation, and that gets actually back more to the reactive piece. At this point, we don't know what we don't know until we have a better understanding, at least, of potentially a fiscal year to enact more accurate legislation. But it takes the input and the partnership of so many organizations and the willingness to come forward, because as Michael said, there's always that fear of what happens if we turn over all of our equipment for forensics and we go out of business. There has to be a good measure of give and take from both sides in this relationship.
Stupendous. Taking it full circle there, Ryan. Much appreciated. Thank you again for all your contributions and hard work on this session. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing everyone next Wednesday. Have a good one. Bye now.
Now.
Take care. See you guys.